think you did mention it.
Welcome, everyone.
Show it now to the people.
We're going to get started right on time because we have such a dynamic panel and they have so much to say. So I want to launch in. Welcome to Radical Goals for Black Homeownership and Access to Housing. This is going to be an amazing panel. We're going to start off with having everybody introduce themselves and tell you just a little bit about how their work intersects with the topics of the day. And I will go first. I'm your moderator today, Miriam Axel-Lute. I'm the CEO and editor-in-chief at Shelterforce magazine. We're a national magazine that covers housing justice and community development for all of you and other folks who work anywhere in the intersections with those topics. And of course, if you're talking about housing in this country, you have to talk about race. If you're talking about anything in this country thoroughly, you have to talk about race and racial justice. So that is certainly something that we do. We recently published a 6-week series on the racial wealth gap and systemic solutions to it, about half of which was focused on homeownership topics. So I am honored and excited to be assisting with this panel today because we are going to go beyond the traditional angles to these topics. So I'm going to turn it over now to Cornell to introduce himself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cornell Cruz Jr. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Reinvestment Alliance of Florida. We ensure that the financial institutions reinvest in the low to moderate income communities. We also establish partnerships and collaborations with nonprofits, corporations, for-profit organizations, and government. And we also train them on the Community Reinvestment Act and how to best employ it. We use this to be a wide variety of things to include transportation, housing, rental assistance, climate gentrification, and income inequality and racial inequality. So our organization has been around for about 6 years. Our founder is sitting right back there, Arden Shank. So we have partnered with the national organization NCRC and been a part of quite a few community benefits agreements concerning the financial institutions. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll head right down the line.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Andreanecia, Executive Director of HousingNOLA. I also lead what we call the Housing Triad of organizations in Louisiana, and we are organized around a very simple concept: put housing first in order to guarantee housing for all. We believe that, as Miriam said, housing is the last unaddressed civil rights issue, and that it is centered around, frankly, hatred of Black women. That is at the root of our housing crisis, as our refusal to acknowledge the racial inequities inherent in our housing system. And we believe by addressing the needs of the most vulnerable, Black women and their children, that is first and foremost is how we guarantee housing for all and put housing first. And that includes creating homeownership opportunities for Black women and their children so that they can build wealth and build wealth in an equitable and sensible manner. So that's me.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Chantel Wilkinson. I work at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition on a campaign called Opportunity Starts at Home. That campaign is really about bringing together multi-sector organizations to advocate for federal housing policy, affordable federal housing policy. So we're basically the foundation of the fundamental idea that we tackle is that if you're an educator, if you're a doctor, if you are someone who works in civil rights, an activist, environmental, any way, that housing is at the foundation of that those goals and priorities cannot be achieved without affordable housing and access to housing. And so we bring together organizations that come on board, and they come on board to advocate for housing policy. And we do that through several ways. So we have national organizations that are involved with the campaign, as well as state organizations that are involved with the campaign, all built around this multi-sector approach. It really is about seeing people in a holistic manner, talking about these systems and seeing people as individuals which these issues intersect. And so as we'll have this conversation today, you'll hear a lot about those spillover impacts of housing and why these voices have come together through the campaign. And NLIHC, in a broader sense, we advocate for those at the lowest income spectrum for access to affordable housing. I'm glad to be here.
And I am Diedrich Asante Mohammed, Chief of Membership Policy and Equity at NCRC. I've been focused in the racial wealth divide space for about the last 20 years, and being focused in that, issues of home ownership has always come up and is central to that. Worked with NCRC to produce a paper called 60% of Black Home Ownership, a radical goal, with a focus on trying to highlight. I mean, I don't think people understand there is inequality in home ownership. I don't think people understand the radical action necessary. I'm not saying radical just because, yay, I like radicalism, but it's just, we need some, I mean, I do, yay, like I do like radicalism, but it's not because of that. It's because we really need radical change if we're going to move the divide of home ownership, which really hasn't bridged over the last 50, 60 years. Also just want to note, we have Sally and Monica passing out this book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century by William Darity, one of the more important books recently focused on African Americans. Obviously, if you don't want it, you don't have to take it, but they'll be passing it around. And Sally, do we have a few more upstairs too, or you just have what you have there? We have what we have. Okay, all right. And yeah, so hopefully you will get the book, but they'll be passing it around. So thanks everyone for coming out.
Great. So we're going to start off. The housing market has been on everybody's lips recently with even more increases in costs and then shifts in interest rates and things. So we're going to start off by addressing a little bit of how is the housing market affecting Black home ownership and access to affordable housing. I'm going to start down there with Diedrich, then Chantel, Cornell, and Andreanecia.
Yes. So, how is the housing market? And I think, again, I started off noting that there really hasn't been a bridging in Black-white homeownership inequality for the last 50, 60 years. So, I think oftentimes people take the current crisis and say this is really having a dramatic effect on lack of Black homeownership or lack of affordable housing. I think the more important story is that we've had a radical divide for 60 years during generally good economic times, bad economic times, pre-COVID, post-COVID. So it's not just about getting past the immediate crisis or the immediate moment. And I think there is a lot to be nervous about in the immediate moments, right? I've been saying, I don't think the COVID recession for regular people is really going to hit until, I would say, 2022, 2023, because the government did do a lot in getting money out to regular people, did do a lot on preventing foreclosures. And it was clear to me that once those measures are removed, that's when regular people are going to be feeling the results of COVID financially. And actually, we're still seeing even health-wise. And so I do think, again, we should look at the concerns around inflation of home ownership, rising interest rates, apartment prices going up. In general, that's going to make a hard situation harder. But I think we really have to look at it's a long-term problem. It's not a problem of the immediate. A bailout around our current inflation is not going to do something significant in bridging Black-white home ownership. There's something fundamental. There's not something, many things fundamental that need to be changed if we want to go on a path of home ownership, equality, equity.
Thank you. And I will, just bridging off of that, looking at the broader view in the national context of what it means to be in what we call a housing crisis. So as I mentioned, on the campaign, we focus on housing and its spillover impacts to other sectors, meaning that housing affordability is central to healthcare, education, economic growth, food security, civil rights, and so much more. And so even with that, we've seen that the housing crisis has reached historic heights, and it negatively impacts the lowest income renter. Federal assistance is chronically underfunded and has been for decades. The nation has 11 million extremely low income renters facing a housing shortage of approximately 7 million homes that are affordable and available to them. Extremely low-income renters are the most in need for affordable housing, and yet they have the least amount of units available to them. Across the nation, there's only 36 affordable and available homes for every 100 extremely low-income renter household. And as a result of this shortage, many households are cost burdened. And when we say cost burden, that means that they're spending more than 30% of their income on rent. So this directly contributes to a household need to, bridge that gap between rent and the other necessities that they may need, like healthcare or food. It also makes it really difficult for households to accumulate emergency savings. So they're not equipped to handle something like a medical bill or a broken down car expense. And so in this way, the shortage of affordable housing and resulting cost burdens contributes directly to housing instability and homelessness. Of the 11 million extremely low-income renter households in the United States, 71% are severely cost burdened. So that means they're spending more than 50% of their income on housing. And so when we say this, I think there's also been a misconception of what these households look like that we're talking about, because there's a lot of stereotypes of what that could mean. And really what we're talking about here is this group is comprised of seniors, people with disabilities, those that are in the labor force, taking up a huge amount of that, as well as people who are enrolled in school, people who are single adults caring for young children, and people with disabilities as well. So this is the group that we're really talking about that are severely cost burdened, spending more than 50% of their income on housing. Housing is simply unaffordable. We can see this by looking at wages. Wages have been stagnant for decades, and the cost of housing just keeps on increasing. Last year, the housing wage was $24.90. So what that means is that a full-time worker must earn $24.90 an hour to afford a two-bedroom apartment. And this means that for a one-bedroom apartment, a full-time worker must earn $20.40. And we know that the federal minimum wage is still $7.25, so that's more than double of that minimum wage that we see. And so households that really need the assistance, we also notice that they're not getting it. 1 in 4 eligible households that need federal assistance actually get the assistance that they need. And we also get some feedback around how this is like an urban issue, and it's really not. We see it in suburban and rural areas all over the nation. In fact, only 7% of U.S. Counties, and there's 3,000 counties across the U.S., where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a one-bedroom rental home at fair market rent. And so as we are talking about here today, Black people, they feel this most acutely because of racism, past and present. Black households are more likely to be extremely low-income renters, severely cost burdened, and face a disproportionate risk of eviction. And so just talking about the crisis in a broad sense, we really are experiencing a crisis, and we have been for decades, and the federal government definitely has an important role to play in funding programs that will address these issues. And it severely impacts, as my panelists here too have been saying, that gap that we're talking about today. So just defining the problem in a general sense, as you guys have heard, it's really been a crisis that we've been addressing for decades and decades. Okay.
So I agree with everything that's been said, and one of my pet peeves is, and I will say it until the cows come home, is corporations and hedge funders purchasing homes. In our state, in the state of Florida, it has been such a huge deal. 60 Minutes actually did a piece on it a few months ago. In it, one of the hedge funders that was purchasing homes actually said that Americans want to rent the American dream. They no longer want to buy the American dream. And to be honest with you, I would have loved to jump through the TV and just grab them by. I don't approve of violence, but every now and then some people need an ass whooping. Just honestly. But for instance, in our state and in South Florida, Miami-Dade, Broward County, which is Fort Lauderdale, and Palm Beach County, which is Palm Beach, in November, one hedge funder purchased 1,800 single-family homes. 1,800. They're going to turn them into forever rentals and never give low to moderate income and middle income the opportunity at the American dream. And as all of you well know, land, therefore a home, has been the American way since the Pilgrims came. Thus, that's why they took it from the Indians, right? But land and a home is the first stage towards generational wealth, or leaving any type of generational wealth. And as is well known, has been said in this country on many, many occasions, when white people catch a cold, African Americans catch full-blown pneumonia. So with corporations doing the buying of these homes and pricing us out of the opportunity to own, they're not only impacting our wealth, but also impacting generational wealth as you want to pass it down to your siblings, or correction, to your family members. So I think that's been one of the biggest burdens so far. Besides all the things that have been mentioned, now we have to deal with this in the 21st century of this corporate buying of homes, and that's shutting out, in particular, African Americans who want to purchase a home. There's ways we can get around it, but that's going to take some political will, and sometimes that's very, very tough. Hopefully, I've seen some things. Folks from Dallas, I know, and Dallas City Council has looked at ways to mitigate purchasing en masse like this, and or the city of Orlando in Florida has tried to do it as well. But it's going to be one of those things that's keeping home ownership down and making it even more of a cost burden, and making it very, very difficult for those of us who want to purchase a home to be able to actually purchase that home. And unless we do something about it in a hurry, we're going to be even more cash strapped, and will back us up per Diedrich's study and the NCRC study that he did. That's going to back us up even more and widen that black-white home ownership gap.
So I want to take a minute to kind of flip this question over, because I kind of reject the premise of it inherently, that the notion that somehow the affordable housing market is different from the rest of the housing market. That is a huge problem that we have in this country, that somehow what's happening in housing, prices are skyrocketing. How does it affect affordable housing when that problem is inherent to the market? It is, it's not a feature, it's a feature, not a bug. This is how we think it's supposed to work. And when we talk about building generational wealth, we start with, when we refuse to acknowledge what's going on with renters, when we refuse to acknowledge talk about what's happening with home ownership and how people are losing it, when we refuse to talk about race when it comes to housing, we gloss over the hard parts and kind of settle for the stereotypes, to Chantel's point. So one of the things that, and the reason that we're having this hot conversation right now is because of inflation, right? People are concerned about how much a gallon of gas costs. People are concerned about how much it costs for a 2x4 to build housing. When, again, any economists in the room want to explain to folks how housing prices drive inflation, not the other way around, right? That is, and that's stuff we used to know in this country. That's stuff that we used to understand. We keep looking away from our failure to guarantee housing for everyone. We continue to let housing not just be commodified in this incredibly extractive way, but also it's a signature of status. It is and we don't want to share. That somehow if we give a low to moderate income person a home that nourishes them, that lets them thrive, and if you are wealthy or upper middle class and you're paying for something nicer, it is somehow worth less because someone else has the base minimum. And then we allow, when we talk about home ownership, we continue to allow this notion to be perpetrated that somehow all we need to do is make sure black people get a chance to buy a house. And we don't think about how it's going to be passed on as generational wealth, to Cornell's point. We don't look at investing in preserving home ownership opportunities. And we also ignore the elephant in the room. We're talking about building wealth and generational wealth. How it becomes generational wealth, what are you going to do with it when you inherit grandma's house? Are you going to sell it? Because is that wealth? Or are you going to rent it out? So when you stand up and say, when your elected officials stand up and say, well, I don't want to talk about rentals because I want to talk about home ownership, you should push back on them and say, we can't have first-time home ownership until we have stable, successful renters. We can't have generational wealth without renting to other people. So if we do not flip this on its head and really think about this in a more holistic fashion, we're not going to get anywhere if we continue to see this as this zero-sum game. If we continue to say the only way we can build wealth successfully, reasonably, is to deny opportunities to other people. Particularly, and I have a real problem with that because the people we're picking on are black women. We've decided that it's black women who have to be kept out of housing opportunities. So I have a real problem with this for obvious reasons. You all should have a real problem with it too. Not just the other black women in this audience. Because if you are going to deny it for me and other black women, it can be, and it is being denied to the rest of you for other reasons. You may be LGBTQ+. You may be poor. You may not be as educated. Or you may be the victim of COVID. Yeah, you could be a black man. There are other reasons that are given to deny you this opportunity. And so we have to flip this on its head and really look at the housing market. And when we talk about being radical, the radical solutions are ones that start with everyone having these opportunities. That's radical.
And I'd like to build off one point that was put forward about really getting clarity about the market and affordable housing, right? Because the market by itself has never brought about affordable housing, right? Like whites didn't become majority homeowners by just a strong market, right? It was a massive government programs. Whites didn't become mass homeowners by just the market. It was by conquering land and then redistributing it, right? So there is this, I think it's really important you highlighted that idea, that this idea when the housing market's going good, but that has little to do with what our people and doing well in terms of home ownership, in terms of affordable rental. So just wanted to build off of what you said.
Thanks, Diedrich. Amen. So Andreanecia just mentioned holistic solutions, and so we're going to move into talking about one of the other big contexts that is affecting housing right now, and that's climate change. I'm going to start on this end, this time with Cornell, and head that way.
Thank you, Miriam. So climate change is a big deal in Florida in particular. Miami is ground zero for sea level rise in the world. If you stand in downtown Miami, you're never, ever, ever above 4 feet, more than 4 feet above sea level, ever. We have a thing there called climate gentrification, where our highest points in the county run right down through, or even through the lower 3 counties, Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County. The ridge runs right through low to moderate income communities. So the developers are finally realizing that. So the developers are now going in and purchasing properties in those high-rise areas or higher ground areas. And as I stated, most of those folks are LMIs. So now what they're doing is they're actually going in and offering those folks little or nothing for their homes. One area in particular, which is just north of downtown, called Little Haiti. Little Haiti is, as you might ascertain, is mostly Haitian immigrants. So they may not be aware of the ways of our country just yet. So they've purchased a home, and developers are going in and giving them little or nothing for their homes, and they actually believe that they can actually go out and purchase another home. Not so. In South Florida, rents alone in January and February went up 55%, just in those 2 months. The average medium home that in the last 21 months went from $365,000 to $585,000. So they can't afford to purchase a new home, and that's in that climate gentrification, as the water rises, and we're not doing anything about it really. As the water rises, it's moving those folks out. Excuse me. So another thing that climate has played a part in is that it's gotten so bad in our county that you can actually go to our Miami-Dade County map, put in your address, and it'll tell you whether your area is going to be flooded in the next 25 years, whether it's going to be underwater, right? But In those same areas, developers are still throwing up $1 million condos left and right because they're going to get their money and they're gone, so they don't have to deal with it. So as people, the more people who move to our state and more people who move to our particular area, as they realize that the developers are reading, developers are moving slowly further and further west. And by moving west, they're getting the high ground. Now, in Florida, particularly South Florida, if you know, we have nowhere to go. You have the Atlantic Ocean on one side, the Everglades on the other. So there's really nowhere to go but either up or out. So as it affects as climate change and the rising waters affect our real estate, it also affects the low to moderate income folks. And we have constantly working to try to mitigate that and advocating for climate gentrification changes and the advocacy of developers not taking over our low to moderate income areas. If you live in Florida or if you've read anything about Florida, we're known for three things. We're known for hurricanes, we're known for alligators, and we're known for developers taking over our state. And nothing is built, nothing is done in our state without developers. When you come to South Florida, I can take you around South Florida, and there'll be very few places that have a blade of grass that's not built on. Very few. And if it is a blade of grass without something built on it, it's either a park or something is really, really radical wrong with that particular piece of real estate. So it's becoming a huge problem with climate change. How we're going to mitigate it, we've been talking about it for the last 15 years, to include building a wall to try to mitigate the waters, or trying to take New Orleans, take and build dikes. But at the same time, we're going to ruin the scenery. You know, everybody wants to be able to see the water. Yeah, but I think I want to be able to survive to see the water first.
You gotta live with the water.
Yeah, I gotta live with it. I gotta live with it. And it affects the low to moderate income so much because where they're gonna go. I'll give you a perfect example that also goes with climate change and prices. In Key West, the folks who lived in Key West could no longer afford to live there, and the water's rising. So those folks who lived in Key West moved to Homestead, which is on the mainland, right? That's a 2.5-hour drive from Homestead to Key West, one way, every day. And if you've ever been to Key West before, ever drove it, there's only one way in and one way out. So if there's an accident on US 1, you're stuck for the next 4 to 6 hours just sitting there. So we have to find ways and encourage government in order to mitigate our flooding issue, and to stop the developers from coming in and purchasing those homes. We got a lot to do and a lot of work to do, but hopefully we can make it happen over the next few years.
So one of the things that, when we talk about climate change, to Cornell's point, is, again, making sure that people can stay in their homes in the long run, right? Especially when you're talking about building wealth and radically building wealth. One of the frustrations that we have in our work in Louisiana is our failure to address climate change in a way that is thoughtful and responsive and immediate. One of the things that we can do immediately, there's a lot of anxiety, and rightfully so, about the climate crisis, right? We've got, in Louisiana is ground zero for it. Not only like Miami, like Florida, we are dealing with the consequences of it with climate intensified storms. Not just hurricanes, but actually polar vortexes. Louisiana has been, the Gulf really has been sieged. We've been besieged in the last 20 years by climate intensified events. And so yes, we have tried to make investments, we've tried to secure funding to make our communities safer, but we are not investing in our people in their homes. We are instead allowing them to be resilient and marveling at their resiliency as they get up after getting hit time and time and time again. And so, and a lot of the national climate change work ignores communities like the Deep South and kind of writes us off as, we're too stupid to understand what we need to do. When people are dealing with immediate issues that are also connected to climate change, not just hurricanes, but energy inefficiencies. Louisiana has the distinction of having the third highest energy cost burden in the country. with 622,000 residents, energy cost burden. 622,000 households, renters and homeowners, being energy cost burdened. And so when we talk about immediate issues, we could make those homes net zero. That could be a generational investment that would do several things. It would reduce residential emissions, which in Louisiana are about 30% of our emissions. That's not everything. That's something, though, that we could do today. That's something we could start today. That work is the work that would create jobs and opportunities. It would also make these homes, because once you make them net zero, you make them energy efficient, you make them more affordable, you also make them healthier, which is a big problem we have, to Chantel's point, not just in urban cities, not just in New Orleans and Shreveport and Baton Rouge, but in Bunkie and in Madisonville and all of these other small places all over Louisiana who think that affordable housing is a black problem when it's not. And it's something that, again, we're missing out on. It is a perfect intersection. It's something that we could do immediately and solve a lot of problems, and it's not something that we talk about. You talk to the average climate justice warrior, not in Louisiana, they are not focused on housing. They're not focused on rebuilding community. It's much more existential, it's much more focused on polluters, and again, that is not to say that those things can't and shouldn't be addressed. But those interventions are going to take time. Those interventions are going to take political will. And if you invest in the people, guess what you also get? Some help with political will. Because when your municipality balks at modernizing their buildings, when their employers balk at reducing their carbon emissions and decarbonizing and reducing their footprint, those homeowners and those renters can say, well, they did it to my house a couple of years ago and it's great. Why wouldn't you want this for your business? Why wouldn't you want this for your community? Why wouldn't you want this for your municipality? We have to start investing in people in ways and in ways that gets us to these other issues. And housing is key to that. Yeah, housing is at the root. You can't name a social issue that is plaguing us where I can't, Chantel can't, Cornell can't, Deidre can't, Miriam can't show you how the failure to address housing is impeding that issue. And most people don't think about it in that way. And climate change is another one of those. We could do this immediately. Why aren't we? Why aren't we even talking about it?
Thank you. No, I'm going to double down. Environment and housing are inextricably linked. So for us, it's very important that those who advocate for environment also advocate for affordable housing. Many other links are clear, like transportation admissions. If housing is expensive near your job or by transportation, you move further out. When you move further out to get in, you're clogging roads. There's emissions, there are greenhouse gas emissions. There's free and open space that's now limited and unavailable. And so as the conversation around climate change just continues and it continues to evolve, we know that the livelihood of billions of people will change, and we need to make sure that we're aiding in that change so that they can withstand it as well. We've seen it and witnessed it through the pandemic. And so to address these issues, it really means that we need a framework that really also addresses the racial equity that's needed in a lot of these policies, and it's been failing us. So this still impacts the policies that we have today, that we need to address the issues that we have around environment as well as housing. And if we want to see the radical change that we keep talking about, we need to address affordable housing as well. And so it's necessary. For us, we really do lean on our partners at the Natural Resources Defense Council to really advocate around climate change and affordable housing. So I'll just mention something before I move on as something that one of our long-standing partners said recently. And so a lot of what we influence, how to get people into affordable housing, this determines the amount of emissions that comes through homes. We're slowly learning that we have to think about climate change as not merely the science of emissions or modernizing the grid or infrastructure. It's also this core social policy about how people can afford to live in a safe, affordable, healthy home that is energy efficient and includes other green amenities. The Natural Resource Defense Council has come a very long way in thinking of itself as a holistic human institution. And we're hearing this not only from environment, but also in healthcare. You know, it's really this view of looking at people and the issues that we have in a very holistic way. And it starts with housing. Housing is so foundational to so many issues that we talk about. Again, doubling down on what the other panelists have said. You just see how where you live really impacts everything around you, your healthcare, where you get food, what medicine is available, what healthcare is available and close to you, and it definitely has an impact in the environment. We've seen it time and time again. You know, unfortunately, we've seen it in events that cost lives, and it's really sad that we're still in a place where we're having to advocate for these issues. But as we say in the campaign, if you're advocating for the environment, you also need to be advocating for affordable housing as well.
And I just want to add a little story, because, you know, I think oftentimes people think, if they think about climate change, they think about New Orleans, they think about Florida. But I just want to highlight, I live in a suburb closer to Baltimore, and we've had, in a place called Ellicott City, we've had 2 once-in-a-100-year floods in the last 10 years. And, like, as a kid, there used to be flooding, and that would mean, like, there'd be water going over your foot, over your shoes. This was water that was pushing over cars. Like, we lost, I think, 1 person died the first one, and then about 4 people got swept away. But like, just raging waters coming down. And they're doing studies on this, but I don't think it was a coincidence that they've old Ellicott City was down at the bottom of an area. And there used to be kind of hills with trees, what have you. And we think it's a coincidence, about 20 years ago, they developed the hilltop, right? And so now you have this pavement. You don't have the grass pulling in the water. You have it going straight down. And so it's just, you know, every decision we make about development needs to have a climate justice factor. And 2, I just want to get into this affordable housing thing. I went to a celebration around some affordable housing development, and I found out midway that the starting price was over $600,000. And at first I was all motivated, but yeah, well, look at this beautiful stuff. And when people moved in, and then they were like, and the starting price is $600, you know, and maybe it's cheaper than the thing down the block, but like, we have to be real about what is affordable for who.
Right.
Yeah,
Right?
That's
And like,
That's right.
and so we have to be very focused on that. And it should be considered, like, there's regulation about having affordable housing. In my mind, there should be more regulation about, you have to get a special permit to create unaffordable housing. Right? Like, you know, that's where we need to be. You need a special permit for anything above, whatever your local area is, 300,000, 400,000, whatever your local area is, right? And a special permit for things that are going to have a negative impact on climate justice, because that's where we are, right? Like, it's not like, oh, this might get bad. It's bad, like with climate justice. It's bad that African Americans have a 43% homeownership rate. Whites have a 73% homeownership rate about, and our radical goal of 60% black homeownership still isn't equality.
Nope.
I just felt like asking for a 50% increase in black homeownership for every 20 years seemed pretty radical. I was scared to ask for more, so I wasn't even trying to get to equal with whites. I was just like, can we just get strong majority black homeownership, right? So again, we just really need to look at the real problems, what are the real solutions. Maybe there's not the political will, but I find if we only allow the narrative to be driven by what is considered the political will, we won't even identify what the real problem is.
That's right. That's right.
So can I add one more thing about climate change and climate gentrification? Because there we put the 2 together. And something Andreanecia addressed about how to help change policy, or at least force policy. So NCRC is all about the Community Reinvestment Act and banks reinvesting in the community. So let's pick on them. And I say that because I think about all the things that we could do with policy and how policy could be driven and how we can initiate policy if we had some more help from the financial institutions. And here's I'm gonna use a perfect example. In our area, our financial district is called the Brickell area. In Brickell, all the banks, all the financial institutions have their corporate offices and things of that nature there. Here's the kicker about Brickell. Brickell floods constantly. We have something we call moon tides, which means that when the moon is close to the earth, our tides go up Brickell area, the tides go up to about your knees or higher, and that's when it's 80 degrees and sunny outside. And this happens to us anywhere from 4 to 6 times a year. So one of the banks actually finally opened an office in Miami-Dade County, and they opened it downtown in Brickell. So I was talking to the bank president, and I said, "You do know you're in a flood area, right?" He said, "What?" I said, "You're in a flood area. There's going to be at least 4 to 6 times a year that your folks are not going to be able to get to work because it's underwater." And I didn't know that. Okay, cool, you didn't know that, but you know it now. If we had, just think, when we stand up in front of county, city commissioners, community commissioners, municipalities, and that bank is standing next to us because we're addressing a need that that they share as well, think how powerful that is. I don't even want you to talk. You don't have to say one word. Just stand there with me while I yell and scream and pound the podium, okay? If we can get those folks, when the wealthy are affected or corporations are affected, you notice how quickly stuff gets done? One thing the pandemic proved to me is when we want to get something done and we need to get something done, it happens like that. So why we can't do that all the time? So I would employ the financial institutions in the room to partner with the nonprofits and partner with community advocates to help get policies and bring procedures down that can help the whole community, not just a small few.
That was a perfect transition to the next question, which was about responsibility. How do we balance? We talk a lot about public responsibility, but there's also private responsibility, private institutions and the roles that they play. So jumping off from Cornell's comments, Andreanecia, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So we absolutely have to balance it. You know, again, one of the big things that we want to see from the public sector is market regulation. I know that's a dirty word to a lot of people. They get really nervous about that. But the fact of the matter is, to Deidre's point, we cannot allow these things to go unchecked. We cannot ignore programs, government programs that have been put in place that were wildly inequitable, government policies that we're still living with, right? Some of us in our communities have restrictions and covenants and zoning policies to this day that perpetuate the inequities that we've been talking about today. So government's got to lead, and it's got to frame the market in a way that's really helpful and strong. And then we've got to also look to our friends in the private sector. Again, to Cornell's point, one of the things that was really perplexing during COVID was the fact that landlords who had used their position and actually have in places like Louisiana and other parts of the country where people equate property ownership with citizenship. And it's not just the rest of the country, it's the whole country, right? When we think about the inequities in our country's founding, we talk about the fact that enslaved Africans could not vote when this country was founded. Women could not vote. Native Americans, people who were on the shores who could not vote. There's another group that we forget about, white men who didn't own property. And I'm not here to cry for them, but I'm here to point out that going back to the country's founding, ownership of property was the clearance to mean that you were a citizen. And we've been chasing that standard ever since. So when we talk about that now, when we look at COVID and when you think about before COVID, when you think about how landlords in so many parts of the country, don't want to be regulated, want to talk about, well, it's my property, I own it, and they don't, renters' rights is, not something that they want to talk about. And then when you see the effect of that with COVID, how landlords, again, not crying for them, but how landlords were excluded from PPP loans. It's not seen as a business, right? Yeah. And then when we see how badly so many of our municipalities did when given billions of dollars in rental assistance, allowing thousands of households to be evicted, and the landlords, instead of turning to their clients, their customers, and saying, we're in this together, they're screwing both of us, and we need to work together hand in hand to make sure that you, renter, can have a stable home, and me, landlord, can pay my bills. Instead, they went balls to the wall to fight against the perceived notion that they would be forced to house people during a pandemic and not be compensated. Instead of saying, no, why can't you just pay me? I should be housing this person. They have lost their job through no fault of their own, but that would take the kind of radical acceptance that we're not ready for. And we can do it, but we've got to think about it in these kind of ways. It can't simply be the haves and the have-nots. If your business model is dependent upon someone not having what it is that you are selling, your business model is wildly inequitable and unsustainable. And we have to move past that. We have to recognize, I am not opposed to people making money providing housing, not making money selling houses. I'm not opposed to people building wealth. I am not opposed to those things. But we've got to let go of this bias, this insistence that the only way you win is to make sure that somebody else loses. Because it's not going to work. It's not going to work. That's how you get an inflation, that's how you get us ignoring an inflation crisis driven by housing. Because as soon as everybody sees gas going down below $4 a gallon, we're out of it. Except those of you who you're now paying double what you're paying in your house, because nobody's going to talk about that once gas falls below a certain price. Our friends in the media, Miriam excluded, will stop talking about housing, even though that problem will not have been fixed unless we make some real changes over the next few years.
And I'll just jump in about holding, it's going to require mass government action, but, there's much that private institutions can do, and I think it's us to hold private institutions accountable. I mean, I think now all financial institutions talk about racial equity, right? And many are talking about, green and, climate change, but we got to hold them accountable. Like, how can you say you're, taking important measures for climate change, but you're funding development, which is making climate change even worse, right? Like, we need to hold them accountable on that. How can you say you're for racial equity, but you only loan 4% of your mortgage lending to African Americans and your area is 20% black? And I'll highlight, there's an NCRC fair lending tool for all of our members where you can get the data on the individual banks in your community and how they're lending to different racial groups, how they're doing lending for low to moderate income, all of these things. And so you can say, well, you say you're this, but this is what you're doing. So what is your plan? What are you doing? So we do, again, I don't think the private institution is going to solve it themselves, but we can at least hold them accountable to, some measure of change. And again, that's why we did this 60% black homeownership paper, because I wanted to get understanding, what can I hold all private institutions to do? So nationwide, we need a 50% increase in black homeownership every year. So I want to go to every bank and be, well, where's your 50% increase in black homeownership to help get blacks to 60% homeownership in 20 years, right? So, I think we need to hold them with quantifiable numbers, not just with nice pamphlets and using the politically correct language. Oh, and also just note, I'm going to have to leave a little bit early. I'm I'm moderating the lunch panel, but
Working?
very much enjoying.
Great. Did you want to address that question, Chantal, before you go to
I don't have much to add. I think the question that we get the most in the campaign is why the federal government needs to be involved. And we say all the time it's because we need the investments, and if we need the investments to help state and local governments. But we also make sure to say that the private sector also has a part to play in this as well. So I think the perfect word that was used here is balance, and that we need to see balance in all of those sectors, and the federal government playing its part, state and local playing their parts in terms of policies and local ordinances and all those things, as well as the private sector also playing their part as well to ensure that we do have the kind of outcomes that we're looking for.
Great. So all of you have mentioned at different times there are radical solutions we need if we have political will. And I'm going to ask you now to bring some of those up and say them concretely, but we're going to frame this in this way. If all the players, especially the federal government, but all the players, if they really meant it, starting with the conditions as they are right now, if they really meant it, that they cared about fixing this problem, what would it look like? What would be happening? What would they be doing?
Yeah, well, I'll say right now we have an unprecedented moment to invest in targeted affordable housing. In 2021, we saw Build Back Better come up, and that framework had historic investments in affordable housing. So right now we're talking about $25 billion in rental assistance, $65 billion to preserve public housing, and $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund, which is dedicated. It's a dedicated funding stream for the lowest income housing across the country. And so these efforts have been stalled by Senator Manchin of West Virginia, and recently conversations have been starting up, but it sounds like it has recently died again. And so there's this slim chance that we have to include housing, and we continue to keep pushing for that through the campaign and through the work of NLIHC. We recently sent a sign-on letter which has 43 signatories of the multi-sector organizations that are involved with the campaign on that letter, urging Congress to include those targeted housing investments in any reconciliation package that they talk about at this point. And so overall, when we are talking about solutions to affordable housing, we really talk about it in a demand, supply, and prevention kind of bucket. We talk about that in the demand side, that rental assistance is needed, such as vouchers, in order to bridge the gap between rent and incomes. We talk about that we need an increase in supply in area where there is scarcity. So we're talking about that increase in the National Housing Trust Fund. And we also talk about making sure that people who are experiencing some type of unexpected economic shock, like a broken down car, like a medical bill, like lost hours at work, that they don't need to spiral. And we're talking about that in terms of temporary assistance. We did see that through the pandemic. We did have our kind of like emergency assistance needed and was funded to some level, but we need that to be reoccurring. We need legislation that has a stable and permanent temporary assistance fund to make sure that it catches people when there is something unexpected, so they don't need to spiral when something does occur and come up. We also have legislation that has been introduced. We have the Eviction Crisis Act that has the temporary assistance in there, as well as the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act that would create 500,000 new vouchers for families with young kids. So the opportunities are there, the policies are there. We need Congress to act on these bills in order to see some change and some advancement in terms of what we're looking at in terms of the affordable housing crisis. And the last thing I'll mention, and I think it is important to mention and to address, is that it really goes back to that balance, is that we do see limitations with the policies that we're pushing for as well. The federal government is going to, and with these programs, we are talking about huge investments in these programs, but we also do look to the state and local governments to also address things. If we pass vouchers, we also need to ensure that there's a source of income discrimination bill that also couples that, because we know that landlords are rejecting people with vouchers, and that's a problem. And so we need to make sure that there is a balance and everyone is doing their part in terms of the type of solutions that we are talking about. So in terms of what Congress can do today, there are many opportunities actually that are out there. We're just seeing it being stalled. We're seeing frustration across the board in terms of advocacy, because we had these huge investments to all these social programs and historic numbers that have not been seen in housing, and I don't even think has ever been seen in housing. And for it to crumble and pretty much kind of just a dead-end conversation that keeps coming up and coming down again just really shows that if you cared, you would make sure that housing was part of that infrastructure. Housing was part of that reconciliation package without question. And we have advocates that are talking about housing as a fundamental pillar of their own goals and priorities. So it's just important, and I think that the opportunities are definitely out there. It's not that we need to create them. They're there. We're just seeing inactivity in terms of enacting them.
And I'm just going to jump in real quick because I'm going to have to go. I think, those federal policies were great that you listed. I just want to note, I think sometimes we get lost in numbers. I mean, I want quantitative numbers, but sometimes people will, and I think NCRC does it too sometimes, right? We have a $1 billion agreement, or there's $40 billion being spent to this, but what's it doing? So after this $40 billion is spent, is there going to be a 10% rise in affordable housing? Are we bridging this? Without that, I don't care about money being spent to say it's been spent. I want to know what effect do we expect to have afterwards, right? I think of the community benefit agreement. Do we think there's going to be community-wide change? Maybe that's unfair for one institution. So is the institution going to be increasing its percentage of loans to low to moderate income or African American or Latino, whatever you're advocating for? We need to have those end result numbers, not just dollar amounts that seem like a ridiculous amount of money to us, but really would have little effect on the problems we're trying to address. One specific thing I'll put forward too is, I think it's also, one challenge we have is oftentimes when people talk about low to moderate income, that ignores the racial wealth divide, right? Because, African Americans have, middle income African Americans have less wealth than low income white Americans, right? So if you're really trying to create a policy that will also bridge black-white racial inequality, you have to create programs that will create home ownership for people in deep asset poverty and might be middle income or even high income, right? There's a decent amount of quote-unquote high-income African Americans who don't have who aren't homeowners. So you need to have that type of investigation. And there's a thing called special purpose credit programs, right, which banks can do aimed at particular communities. People say, oh, well, you can't just create a program for blacks. Yes, you can. It's called the Special Purpose Credit Program. You can do it for Latinos. You can do it. There's even federally interesting programs for Native Americans in particular for home ownership that need some reform, right? Latino Native American home ownership is only around 51%. So we need to strengthen that. But you can have particular programs for, because we have a particular problem. So we need there's a broader problem. Right? There's affordable housing is a problem as a whole for the country.
That's right.
But there's a particular problem for African Americans. There's a particular problem for Latinos that need to be addressed. So that type of advocacy needs to be a part of it. And thanks everyone for their attendance and thanks for these speakers.
So with Diedrich heading off, I want to amen everything that he just said. And again, talking about why that's so necessary, because again, you can't solve those problems. You can't build a strong foundation on cracks, right? And so if you do these high-level programs, that's what we've been having. And so to also chime in on Chantel's point, there's a bill that's been passed that actually does have these opportunities, but most people don't think of it that way, and we don't talk about it that way. It's the Investing in Infrastructure and Jobs Act, where there are billions of dollars being made available actually for weatherization to address the kind of problems that I talked about earlier that we could use to address the 622,000 households in Louisiana who are energy cost burdened. Why aren't we? Right? Why we're going around and allowing this to be framed in a gray infrastructure language when there is oodles of green infrastructure and equitable infrastructure funding inside of that. And we're ignoring, frankly, the last time we did this bill is often compared to the New Deal. But students of history know that the New Deal was wildly inequitable. It built a lot of the modern public housing. It also built it in segregation. It enshrined segregation inside of that public housing. In Louisiana and New Orleans, for example, the first 6 public housing developments that were built as a result of the New Deal were built in segregated pairs. One for black, one for white, on and on and on. That's what came out of the New Deal. We also talk about the GI Bill and how it was wildly inequitable and not implemented, and how African American soldiers who served with distinction amongst the greatest generation were actually prevented from taking advantage of it. So that's why Diedrich mentioned that we have to have those targeted responses because the bias was targeted. The hate was targeted. In order to address it, you can't just throw out there and say, well, anybody who might be hurt by this, come and who might be experiencing this problem, come and take advantage of these other programs. And so we need to be looking at the infrastructure bill in a different way. And we need to be asking our leaders, we need to be asking the Biden administration to put the money where the need is. Forget about their mouths, right? We don't care if they put the money where their mouth is. We care if they put the money where the need actually is.
So I'd like to see a couple of things that I'd like to see done, and I agree with my esteemed panelists, but a couple of things, and that's strong penalties for predatory discriminatory lending practices. I think it's crazy how we're in the 21st century and we're still here. I constantly say, why am I still fighting the same fights that my grandmother fought in the 50s? I think we got to address those predatory and discriminatory practices. And another thing I'd like to add is appraisal. If I'm an African American and I see that African Americans are routinely, their appraisals are being routinely downgraded simply because of their African American, that discourages me from buying a house as well. I put all this sweat and money and everything else into purchasing a home, and then someone has the authority to come in and down my appraisal simply because they don't like my skin color. There are 78,000 appraisers in this country. Less than 2% are African American. Less than 2%. And we had a meeting with NCRC. We had a meeting with the HUD secretary, and one of the things we brought up is somehow, some way, we got to get more training and more diversity in appraisers. So that's something else that we truly need to work on. And then the last thing one of the last things I would like to talk about is improving loan officer diversity and inclusion. USA Today, late last October, ran an article about a professional basketball player that wanted to purchase a home. So he got his realtor, found the house, went to do the mortgage, and the mortgage officer actually asked him, "How do you want to be? What race do you want to check on the mortgage form? Do you want to check African American, or do you want to check white?" And he's African American, and he said, "Why would I check white?" He said, "Well, you got a better chance of this mortgage going through if you check white." This just happened last year. Again, here we are in 2021, still addressing the same things that we had problems with in the 50s and 60s. And this was a man who had means, guaranteed contract, and wanted to purchase a home. So I think we have a lot of work to do as far as the predatory and discriminatory lending practices and the diversity and inclusion of the loan officers as well. So I think that's also some things that we definitely have to work on.
Great. Thanks, Cornell. So we have questions. I'm going to move right into those. So we have, and if you are willing, say your name, your organization, and also maybe stay at the mic and see if the panelists want to ask you anything in return. Have a little bit of a dialogue.
Oh, that's no problem. That's why I wanted to get up here quickly. So, first I want to say I really appreciate Ms. Morris. I always love when I hear people that can speak about historical facts, not just speak emotionally. I'm a great historian, and I appreciate that. And Bill Russell was one of the people in the 50s who got 11 championships with Boston and wasn't able to move into the neighborhood. So I hear what you're saying. But my question has a lot to do with us as a people. Us as a people when we're talking about being able to purchase homes. And my thing is, many of us have been brought up in rental homes, generation to generation. My career started out as a debit agent. So I'm in the projects. Those were my clients. And so from generation to generation, the great-grandmother, the grandmother, the mother, the baby girl, they all got pregnant. They all lived in the projects. Being taught they can't buy homes. Being taught they can't afford to buy homes. Being taught that buying homes is a white people thing. So I'm coming back to this point. How is it that we can bring about the education to our people, for them to be taught about being able to purchase homes, for them to understand this thing about the wealth process, for them to know not just how, why, what, how, the possibilities of purchase, and what they can do to basically purchase a home. How can we go about that? Because it's easy to point fingers at white folks.
No, we've got to address that. That's the elephant in the room, right? Because what ends up happening is that, unfortunately, everyone knows someone who embodies the welfare queen stereotype, right? That's part of the reason why we don't like to let it go. So one of the things that we've been talking about in Louisiana with our Housing for All strategy is, and it's something that needs to happen with disaster funding. It needs to happen when we have COVID relief. It all needs to be paired with comprehensive wraparound supportive services. We have got to acknowledge that housing insecurity has traumatized generation after generation after generation, and it needs to be addressed. one of the things, and sometimes it results in behavioral problems, behavioral issues that we dismiss with the brushes of classism and intra-racism and sometimes colorism and all the other isms. We say that that person's trash, that they don't want to act right. Instead, looking at, well, what's the trauma, right? What caused the behavior? Where is the intervention? Where's the investment in that person? And something that we're really sensitive to in New Orleans because we've had so many disasters and so many crises. And then you watch our government respond with callousness and insincerity and just fear sometimes. Like you have program officers, staff who've been hired to run programs. You're telling people when they come in, I can't help you because the program has been designed in a way without any thought, without any regard for that person. And when that person has an emotional response, what happens? There's more security put at that, and it's happened time and time again in New Orleans, disaster after disaster. Somebody pops off because they were told something that was wrong, right? They were told, well, I can't help you because we have designed this in a way to screw you, and you got to just sit here and take it.
Right.
And they break in that moment. And they don't do anything. Like, there's no violence. They just get upset, but they're not allowed to be angry because they should come into that situation perfectly behaved in order to get their government handout.
Right.
That is how we view this. And so we've got to recognize so that, yes, our people do need help. They do need support, but our people are not trash. They are traumatized. They are not trifling. They are traumatized. We have got to own that, and we've got to get them help. We've got to get ourselves help. And so we cannot accept that the welfare queen wants to be that way.
Exactly.
So and again, there's different NCRCs talk about, but we've also got to recognize that we let our government cut these programs. Homebuyer assistance has been radically disinvested in since the 2008 financial crisis. And it's one of the craziest things I've ever seen, right? Because the 2008 financial crisis was caused mostly by middle-class folks who did not understand the basics of ARMs, of adjustable rate mortgages, and got themselves into trouble, being preyed upon by by Wall Street and a bunch of other dumb money that wanted to make a lot of money. And instead of saying, everybody who needs to buy a house, we had this conversation last week with a bank I shall not name, where we talked about that bank requiring homebuyer education for all of its lenders instead of ghettoizing it and only saying that it should be required for first-time homeowners. And they said, well, you know, the fact that person bought a $600,000 house when they could only afford $300,000 actually demonstrated that person had financial literacy. That's what one of the bank officers said. Because that person had knowledge of the cracks in the system, and they took advantage of it. That's what we do in this country. We deify money in a way that if you have it or access it, that somehow makes you smart. When actually it doesn't.
Right. Go with it.
I
Right.
want to make
Some
sure
of the dumbest
everyone
people
else.
got money.
I want to make sure everyone else gets
Yes,
a
we
turn
gotta
because
get-
we're running.
Well, let me
running on,
apologize. I
so-
didn't give my name. I am Emmanuel De Shields, and I am the president of the Be Ready Development Corporation. So
Great.
I was supposed to say that first. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you.
Good morning or afternoon, Nikki Beasley, Executive Director of Richmond Neighborhood Housing Services. So we have spent a lot of time as a housing counseling agency getting people qualified, but being from the Bay Area, high-cost market, we've been spending a lot of time on production. So for the panel, especially in local markets, when we talk about innovative, radical solutions, have any of you looked into social impact bonds, which we're leveraging, which is another way to gain capital through banks? Because traditionally what we found, and another question, thoughts about how to change municipalities' thought process that homeownership should not be a focus of affordable housing because, you know, if you can afford a home, then you need no help, as well as uncoupling race and income in those conversations.
I know that I'm glad you brought that up, the social, I love that phrase, social impact investing. I was just at a conference last week talking about social impact investing, and we're looking at it from a point of view of all the money flowing into our state from tech companies and leaving California and New York coming to our state. And we're looking at them as as investing in our housing. Our mayor, Miami-Dade County Mayor, just opened up a fund in order to facilitate those particular items. And so far, she's raised almost $100 million just from the tech companies and things that are moving to our state. So we're trying to invest that. Within CRC, when we do the community benefits agreements, we're bringing that up with the banks so they can invest as well.
And I just want to share, it's a little different than the investment. It's strictly looking at banks to be able to invest, because what tends to happen is they'll say, well, we gave to, LIHTC and others, but this is another
Yeah.
avenue to address the CRE.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Capelli. I'm the Executive Director of the Neighborhood Development Collaborative, which is a coalition of the affordable housing nonprofits in Colorado. And my question is, so actually I think it was Diedrich earlier who said that the market, access to the market is very important in reducing discrimination, but that's not how we got to the homeownership rates broken out by race that we currently have in this country, so that's not enough. There was a huge subsidy that went in, they got us to where we are today, right? So what's the huge subsidy now that we're actually going to use? The Build Back Better plan, insofar as that's sort of like a strategy, is $150 billion for housing. Just based on what I was going through here, only $10 billion is for homeownership, and it's only down payment assistance, which doesn't work in a lot of markets. It certainly doesn't work in Colorado, where housing prices are so high. So, rental housing has a low-income housing tax credit, LIHTC, is that the idea? Is a larger carve-out of HUD funding, a certain percentage of home that has to be used for home ownership? What's the specific federal program at what funding level that we need to drastically increase home ownership in this country? Thank you.
Yeah, I can start off the answer, but my own is going to focus on the affordable housing piece. Our idea here with the affordable housing piece is to address those that need it the most. So I address the need of those that are at homelessness or just right at the brink of homelessness, which they do need rental assistance. We're seeing it. It's literally on the streets. And so when we're talking about vouchers and we're talking about the Natural Housing Trust Fund, as opposed to LIHTC, because LIHTC has a lot of issues, and the National Housing Trust Fund is really specific to those at the lowest income spectrum, without a lot of what we've seen with LIHTC in terms of like the controversy about where those units have been built and how it has not helped with equity over the years. So we talk about fostering inclusive communities, but we really do stay away from necessarily putting a lot of focus on LIHTC and putting it mostly on the National Housing Trust Fund. So when I do talk about affordable housing in this way, in the programs that we're talking about, we're addressing the need of people at the lowest end of the spectrum, so at homelessness or close to. And those programs we see is putting people in housing. And often we say that by not addressing those at the lowest end of the income spectrum, we're having a trickle effect upward, because it's just, they're just trying to get housing, and now we're seeing problems at every income level because we're not addressing those at the lowest end of the spectrum who need the assistance the most. And so just going to put that out there as when we address the need, we are addressing it at that level, and we also say that there are limitations to what we do advocate for in terms of affordable housing, and that's only one piece of the problem that needs to be addressed, but we do know that people need to be housed, and not just housed, but quality housing, like housing that is accessible, that is affordable, that is decent, that is safe, that really does look at the well-being of individuals, and I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I've got a more specific answer on that one as well, because we've done that work in New Orleans specifically as a part of our Housing for All strategy. We actually broke down and looked at the numbers for New Orleans, just for the city of New Orleans, to talk about how do we end the affordable housing crisis, and how do we create first-time home ownership to close down the racial equity gap, racial wealth gap, and promote home ownership long-term. So what are those numbers, and how do we invest in them? And that's one of the things that we encourage people to do, we want people to do mostly, is to talk about in your individual communities, because you're right. There are programs out there that could work in your communities, but there's a lot that won't, and so you need to know those numbers. So the programs that we are looking at, number one, the weatherization funding. That is one, because one of the things that we got to make sure that we do is we've got to talk about preserving home ownership in the long run. So you've got to be making investments in properties. Bringing insurance rates down is going to be a huge issue in this country when it comes to preserving home ownership. So you've got to be making some investments, making programs available that weatherize the home, and also make sure that that home, that the insurance rates are affordable. And that works whether or not it's preservation or first-time home ownership. Because you could have someone qualify for $150,000, you have a developer who's built the homes exactly at that price, but now where we are with insurance, they come in and all of a sudden the deal's dead because you can't make the insurance numbers work because the market's way out of whack. We also talk about not just the home buyer assistance, the down payment and closing cost assistance, but those soft seconds. And making sure that there's money coming in from a variety of sources for those kinds of programs to close those gaps, and to really not to be looking at it as a as a gift, right? We've got to be looking at it as stabilization, neighborhood stabilization, because the prices are out of whack, so you've got to start cooling the market down. And another way we want to look at doing that is increasing production, right? We hate talking about that part of it, but we've got to get our small mom and pop contractors, we have got to get them to stabilize their prices. There's certain things that you can't deal with, right? You can't deal with what a 2x4 costs. That's a national issue, but we can be talking about the fact that this local contractor is working with a nonprofit. I'm looking at one of my nonprofit builders right here from Louisiana, that when they go to build with somebody, they quote them like they're never going to build another house with them again. Right? They might come back in 6 months. They might not. That contractor's like, okay, I got to get all the money I need out of you for this house. I got to tax you a little bit extra because you're a nonprofit. You're going to be slow to pay. And all of these other things, because that business, that contractor isn't comfortable, and again, we lift up these issues. We talk about them in a very, what's the word I'm looking for here? Cavalier way, right? You're like, oh, small businesses, small contractors can do this work, but we're not really looking at the issues. So I come back to, y'all need to really look at the issues, break down the numbers, and there are different programs out there that need to be better capitalized, that can work to address the problems in Colorado.
Thank you. I want the gentleman to be able to go behind me, but every time this argument sort of happens with helping the lowest income folks, more than half of my members serve really, really low incomes, including those experiencing homelessness. So we need to serve those people 100%. However, if you make that argument in an environment of scarcity, it becomes a zero-sum game, and you're only ever going to fund rental housing. We passed about $600 million in housing fund this year just in Colorado, 0 programs from ownership, and it wasn't enough for rental housing. So we can't just kind of have that argument. We need to create new solutions that are as big and bold for home ownership.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
I'll be quick because I know everybody's hungry for lunch. And it's not even to the panel, just a thought for everybody in the room. And I got woken up in the last panel because I got pissed off. Because I had every plan on just coming and learning.
Are you mad with us too?
No. On the feedback, I'll be sure to this is the one I got a book at, so I think this is my favorite panel. But again, this is a critique to NCRC as a paying member of NCRC. I think a lot of this information is very high level, and everybody in here is privileged at some capacity to be here. And I think we really need more folks in the room, or we need to go to people that are affected by these issues in a very real way. Two quick things, and I'm not gonna say shit else while I'm here. I'll give you a prime example for Advocacy Week. NCRC is asking folks from Texas to talk to the offices of Crude and Corwin, right? It's kind of like read the room. Why are we talking to these people that have shown, not only historically, but very recently, that they don't care about black and brown folks, right? Mm-hmm. Two, I'm hoping, I wish Deidre was here, because I'm hoping that NCRC will use some of these conversations that I heard here to start building the people's needs into their advocacy goals and agenda, as opposed to asking us to help you with your policy goals and agendas. Yep. And then the last thing, I think a lot of my frustration with this is what we're talking about is very real. This has been the best panel I've been to so far. And I really think the key missing ingredient that makes this a 7 conference out of a 10 conference is that there are people that are affected by these issues that are not in the room, right? Like, we keep having these intellectual, high-level ass conversations without the people that are in the room. So, again, my challenge, and again, I say this as a person, you ain't got to invite me back. I'm still going to come anyway. Like, I think,
No,
like a lot of this, a lot of this conference setup is missing a geared steering by people that need to be in decision-making seats, right? We need more poor folks. We need more black women, queer folks, incarcerated folks to be on your board to make sure, like, we can take this back in a very real way. And Miriam, that's not, okay. And again, it's just like, and this is my last thing to everybody in the room. I think we have to be serious about being willing to struggle together, right? Like, all right, I'll say this, I'm gonna sit down, swear to God. In 2020, and I knew shit wasn't gonna change because, like, this is American society, right? 2020, everybody was like, George Floyd is the last time this is gonna happen. We all act like we was gonna do something, and then nothing happened because we are so caught up in, like, actually not sacrificing enough to get shit done. In the 60s, I believe it was Iceland or Switzerland, women wanted seats at the table. Women organized throughout the nation to say, you know what, we're not going to work until we get seats at the table. Women stopped working for a week. Country shut down. Now women have been in power in Switzerland or Iceland, one of these countries, for the past 60 to 40 years, right? But in this country, we keep saying we need these things, but then we keep plugging back into the status quo, so nothing changes. Prime example, everybody's talking about we need to do something with gun safety and protect our kids in schools. But come August, in September, you're going to take your kids right back to the schools where nothing is changing, right? So just like, what are we actually willing to do, give up, mobilize and organize to make sure that housing actually becomes a fundamental, basic human right, right? And that's not on you all. You all did fine. NCRC, I'm asking you to not be just another high-level conference. Like, let's actually take this, like, even the fact this conference is always in D.C., like, let's take this conference to New Orleans and Austin, where in 2016, Austin was the most segregated economically city in the country, where rent just went up 54% over the last year. Like, we need to take this to the people as opposed to asking the people to come to us. I got more else to say, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
But wait a
Tell
minute.
us who you are.
Did you say your name?
I'm Chaz Moore from Texas.
Okay, so Chaz Moore, both Andreanecia and myself sit on the board. I wrote down everything you said. I will bring it up. We have a board meeting tomorrow morning.
Yes, we
I will
will.
bring it up at the board meeting tomorrow morning. I can promise you that.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think this is a good space, but it's just like, I think the shit that we're talking about is it's in a bubble of people that can afford to be here. We need to have, you got it.
Yeah.
got
We got you.
All righty.
What about even going to the board member to present it himself?
I don't know if we could do that tomorrow, but I would.
No, he got it. I've been hearing him. We on the same page, brother.
I'll bring it up.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your lunch.